Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. Thrilled to have you here today. A lot to discuss. First of all, our buddy Jon Stinchcomb has not been with us for a while. John's been on vacation. I was on vacation prior to that, so we haven't connected in a live form in quite some time, but today we will get to do that. Very much excited about all of that. Also, off the top of the program today, there is an interesting comparison that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon between Georgia and Texas. Longhorns picked over Georgia to win the SEC. Texas gets another recruiting win against UGA. Sharp contrast, it would appear, between these two programs right now. What does it all mean? We will talk about that off the top, including asking the question of how come it is that no matter how much hype that Texas seems to have gotten, Georgia is the one that's had the success on the field against the Longhorns. We will discuss all of that. Glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Pella Window and Door of Georgia, viewed to be the best.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So at the end of SEC Media Days last week, you had the official votes tabulated by all the media members who were there, at least those that filled out their ballot. To be honest with you, I did not do that. But of all the media members who were there that filled out a ballot, you had a kind of a tabulation of that. We'll talk more about this later on in terms of the All-SEC teams preseason and the predicted order of finish, which I kind of find to be perhaps most interesting here. And Texas was, I don't know if you say overwhelming necessarily, but they did get more than twice as many first-place votes as Georgia did. Texas was the pick to win the SEC. Georgia, the reigning SEC champion, coming in second in the overall balloting. More than twice as many people picked Texas to win the league. They got 96 first-place votes. Georgia, on the other hand, only got 44. Now, I want to tell you why I think this is pretty ridiculous, if I can get this stuff to. I want to tell you why I think this is pretty ridiculous, but in order to do that, I do have to give you kind of one caveat here first. If you look at the last two seasons, the team that has been the most hyped to win the national championship during that offseason, the most discussed team during the offseason, has frankly gone on to win the national championship in each of the last 2 years. And I remember this pretty fondly, or not fondly. I remember this, very well is what I mean to say, because coming off of Georgia's national championship in 2022, when we really felt like we saw Georgia vanquish a lot of critics, silence a lot of doubters, that's a really fun storyline, a really fun narrative. In 2023, I think there was an assumption among many of us, certainly I was probably guilty of this, that Georgia would perhaps just sort of pick up right where it left off. And that didn't really happen. We had laughed at people like Reese Davis and those in the offseason that spent a bunch of time talking about Michigan, but it turned out they were right. A year ago, the same thing sort of true with Ohio State, that Ohio State was the team that was thought to be the big spender in NIL. They were the team that was desperate to sort of correct what had been longer than they would have liked, a drought of winning national championships. And the people that said Ohio State's going to do it, the people that gave Ohio State all that hype, as it turns out, they were kind of right about that. They were sort of true in that they talked up Ohio State, and Ohio State followed that up with a national championship. So it is always my goal to be as honest and candid with all of you as I possibly can be. There is just a chance that the people that are talking up Texas right now at the end of the season will be just as right as those who hyped Ohio State, and just as right the previous year those who hyped Michigan. There is a chance that's true. We have to acknowledge that is a possibility in all this discussion. And yet, understanding that as a possibility, there are still, though, a couple of things about the overwhelming support that Texas seems to be getting for the 2025 season from large pockets of the media that I still find to be pretty wild. I mean, Georgia, the reigning champs, and yet only got less than half as many first-place picks for this year in the SEC. that Texas did. You would think that Texas has like an overwhelming talent advantage over Georgia on paper in order for those predictions to be made the way they are. But to the extent we can measure that, the actual numbers don't suggest that's true. We briefly referenced on Friday's show Bud Elliott. You may know him from 24/7 Sports, CBS Sports. Every year he does what he calls blue chip ratio, the percentage of former 4- and 5-star prospects signed over the previous 4 years for college football teams. It is his closely held belief, and his data backs this up, that you better have a greater than share than not, a majority of your roster of these so-called former blue chip recruits if you want to win the national championship. Otherwise, history suggests that you can. But even with that, as true as that's proven to be, when you look at the actual percentage of former elite recruits, former 4- and 5-star prospects, according to Bud Elliott's blue chip ratio, Texas has got 78%, which is an overwhelming number, more than 3/4 of its roster, former 4- and 5-star players signed over the previous 4 years. However, Georgia still remains higher. 84% of its roster is former 4- and 5-star recruits signed over the previous 4 years. So somehow this Texas roster is so unstoppable that they're their overwhelming pick to win the SEC. And yet Georgia on paper, according to Bud Elliott, CBS Sports, says that the Georgia roster still has a higher percentage of former elite recruits than Texas does. And then you'll zero in on, but what about the quarterback situation, BA? Georgia's got Gunnar Stockton. He is less heralded right now. He is not a former 5-star recruit. Texas, you've probably heard, has Arch Manning coming in at quarterback, and Arch Manning's going to be the next big thing. And as Paul Feinbaum has said, the best quarterback since Tim Tebow. Feinbaum saying that's what Arch Manning already is, which is obviously ridiculous on its face. But that's what Feinbaum has of course said. And listen, we have a lot of people in our lives that know more about all this stuff than I do. No shortage of people who you'd say that about. And people who know more about football than I do, people who are perhaps closer to the situation at Texas and with Arch Manning than I am, they've told me they think Arch Manning's pretty good. And I take their word at that. I don't have any reason to believe that Manning's going to be a total bust, to fall flat on his face, and all of this is just going to be, laughably proven untrue. I don't have any reason to suggest that in the case of Arch Manning. I'm assuming that Manning probably is pretty good. And you might say this year, Manning, because of his pedigree and everything else, maybe he is a better quarterback than Gunnar Stockton's going to be. Perhaps that's the case. And maybe that helps explain why so many more people, by a 2-1 margin, have Texas picked to win the SEC over Georgia. Maybe that helps explain that too. However, there were two other sort of caveats to this that I do think deserve to be considered that don't seem to be considered. Thing number one, and not the least of which, Gunnar Stockton already has a win over Texas. This idea of, well, are we sure that Gunnar Stockton can beat a behemoth like Texas? Folks, he already did. He did so in December. And he's on the field while this, golden child Arch Manning is standing on the sidelines watching. This is well-traveled ground by now. We've discussed this plenty. But that's an important caveat to this in the comparison of, what's it going to look like when Arch Manning plays against Texas? I should say when Arch Manning plays against Georgia, when Gunnar Stockton plays against Texas. Well, in one respect, half that equation we sort of already know. And a brief glimpse of that in October for Arch against Georgia, as you also know, that didn't go very well. And speaking of that game, the earlier win that Georgia got against the Longhorns, this idea that quarterback's going to be the big difference maker that puts Texas over the top against Georgia, it is fair to point out, it's not my intention to drag Carson Beck through the mud here, but Beck played a bad game against Texas in October. He barely completed 50% of his passes, did not throw a touchdown, and threw 3 interceptions, and yet Georgia still dominated the game from wire to wire. So the point here is overwhelming Texas is favored over Georgia, yet the evidence doesn't exactly explain why that might be true. If anything, the actual recent track record would suggest that instead of Texas having some sort of edge over Georgia, it is pretty clearly Georgia who has had an edge over Texas. And there was a question last week at SEC Media Days that I thought really phrased this in an outstanding way. Kirk Bowles is a longtime reporter. You're going to hear his question here in a moment. And the phrase that he uses was special secret. Does somehow Georgia have a special secret for beating Texas? After all, Bowles seems to be one of the rare media members that seems to remember that Georgia did beat Texas twice a year ago. Now, you won't be surprised to learn that if there is some sort of special secret for how Georgia has beaten Texas, Kirby doesn't exactly reveal this during his answer. And yet, I want you to listen very closely. Even though Kirby doesn't quite reveal the so-called special secret for beating Texas, he does say something. He does use a phrase, and perhaps it's incidental. It's not meant to be taken necessarily at face value. But boy, in light of other things that Smart has recently said, I think a statement that Smart makes in this answer about having a so-called special secret for beating Texas, I do think it takes on perhaps extra meaning. Let me let you listen to the question and the answer about how it is that Georgia has been able to have success beating Texas, despite the fact that so many in the media seem to think that Texas is this unbeatable behemoth. This is Kirk Bowles, the reporter, Kirby Smart, the answer. Interesting exchange from last week. Take a listen to this.
Kirby, you beat Texas twice last year. Now you get them at home. Do you have any special secret to beating Sark and any insights from your days at Alabama together that work well toward that end?
No, I think if you're going to beat a good football team, you've got to be sound football team yourself, you know, and I didn't overlap with Sark that I remember at Alabama, so we weren't there the same time. Tremendous respect for him and his program, the job they do. To beat good teams, you got to be a good team. We had a good football team last year, so did they. It's not about us as coaches, it's really about the players and what you believe in. And we got a lot of really good football teams to play next year besides just Texas, so we're preparing for all of them.
So, first of all, Kirby is right. His time at Alabama did not overlap with Sark's. Kirby's first year at Georgia was 2016. Kirby's last year at Alabama was 2015. So when Kirby was at Alabama, Sark was in Atlanta ruining the Falcons' offense. Sark didn't come in as an analyst at Bama until 2016 when Kirby's already at Georgia, so he's right about that. But the phrase that Smart used, and admittedly, maybe I'm about to be guilty of reading a little too much into this. Maybe I'm going to be guilty of this. But you can't help but notice when Smart says it's about the players and what you believe, or as he means to say, what they believe. The belief of the players, the belief instilled into the players by the program. And I think when you hear Smart use a phrase like that, it almost sort of rings in your ears as a throwaway line, just sort of, empty puffery. But when you coincide that with other things that Smart has said, all of a sudden, perhaps a phrase like that, kind of reinforcing the power of belief, all of a sudden it takes on extra meaning. When Smart says, hey, it comes down to what they believe, what we as a program believe. It comes down to our belief. The question that's begged from that is, well, what is it that Georgia believes? Well, in that same press conference last week, Kirby Smart made it very clear about what his belief is about Georgia. And if belief is the thing that powered Georgia to 2 victories against Texas a year ago, the stuff that Kirby Smart says he believes deeply in, all of a sudden we got to lean in more closely to hear exactly what that is. And Kirby Smart last week told us exactly what the belief is that perhaps powers the Georgia success. Here he is again.
We sell relationships over transactions. We think the relationship still wins out because the relationship allows you to push people and demand excellence. And we're going to continue to do that at Georgia. We don't believe in just being transactional, because when you're transactional, you cannot accomplish whatever your ultimate goal is, whatever your greatest reach is, whatever the ceiling is for every player and every team we have. You don't reach that without relationships. So we're going to try to win 24-hour increments each and every day to make sure we still attain that.
So admittedly, I'm perhaps guilty of reading too much into this, but just for fun, let's sort of do this like one of those. You ever watch one of those like Netflix, like true crime docs or something like that? Let's do this like a little bit of a Netflix true crime doc here for a moment. Kirby Smart, in the midst of talking about how it was that they beat Texas twice a year ago, talks about the belief that's instilled in the program. That's clue number one. Clue number two is, in a different clip, Kirby Smart talked about what his closely held belief is, that relationships are more important than transactions. And if you're too transactional as a program, then all of a sudden you have players that won't play with the phrase that Smart used over and over again, fire, passion, and energy. We have reason to believe that's the closely held, deeply trusted beliefs of Georgia. And there's at least some circumstantial evidence that Kirby Smart would say, hey, that's what enabled us to beat Texas twice a year ago. Now, is that true? We can never completely know for sure, but here's what's interesting. There is some reason to suspect that Texas thinks it might be true, because we asked a question last week, and not a rhetorical one, by the way. Why is Steve Sarkisian saying stuff on the podium from SEC Media Days about his NIL prowess that doesn't seem to be true? You might say, to use perhaps a stronger phrase than it deserves, why is he lying? Well, perhaps with good reason, that maybe they think it is possible that there is such a thing as too transactional of a program. Even if your financial wherewithal gives you a chance to sort of consummate a lot of transactions, it's still potentially dangerous to be too transactional as a program. That's why perhaps Kirby Smart wants to draw a contrast, not just between himself and Texas, but between himself and every program that sort of goes about its business like we think Texas does. And that's maybe why Steve Sarkisian was so careful last week to not be described simply as the team that goes out there and uses NIL to win its recruiting battles, that it's picked to win the SEC this season because it's got a team of mercenaries, a bunch of folks who are here for a paycheck, and Texas is trying to be what some would describe as just the latest college football team to attempt to buy a championship. Steve Sarkisian, in not always the most believable fashion last week, tried to make sure we all understood that's not what he thinks Texas is. This is what Sarkisian said.
We only have so much money to go around, and so we've got to do a great job evaluating. We've got to do a great job of rewarding those players that are doing it at a high level within our program so that they don't go anywhere else. But we've also got to continue to develop our players as they grow, and make sure that our players aren't doing this for the idea of money. And I think sometimes, quite frankly, I think it hurts us a little bit in recruiting, in the fact that when kids come on our campus, one of the first things we do, we don't talk about NIL. We don't talk about NIL or revenue sharing or publicity rights until the very end. And that may hurt us on some kids, but if a kid is coming to Texas for that reason, we don't want them anyway. We want kids that want to be at the University of Texas because of the school, the coaches, the team, the culture, all those things that go into it. And oh, by the way, you can get publicity rights or revenue share, so on and so forth. If you're coming for the other reason, he's probably going to be the guy in 18 months that's back in the portal going somewhere else where they're going to offer him more money. Because I can't offer every player the most money that he might get offered from another school. It just doesn't work like that anymore.
Simply put, not anything that Sarkisian says there sounds believable, but the reason why perhaps he attempts to spin that yarn, as unbelievable as it was, is because what Kirby Smart said about relationships being more important than transactions, that comes across as incredibly believable, and perhaps that closely held belief within the Georgia program is one of the reasons why it has had the success against Texas that it's had. And as sort of further proof for why the Sarkisian statement probably simply isn't true, you perhaps saw on Sunday that the outstanding running back, Derek Cooper, chose to commit to Texas. The latest big recruiting win for the Longhorns, something they legitimately should not have to apologize for. But this idea that, we're not about money, that, NIL isn't the most important thing with us. I think some people kind of find that, a strain to believe, given the fact that it's been reported that Cooper, after visiting Miami numerous times, even Georgia several times, chose to go to Texas after never taking an official visit to Texas. And if I have my facts right on this, only visiting Austin just a single time over the course of his recruitment. And yet ultimately that was enough to win that recruiting battle. That would clearly lead you to believe that money must be a huge part of this, because he simply didn't go to Texas frequently enough to develop any relationships. And the Texas recruiting reporters themselves are also seemingly acknowledging that too. I want to show you here a tweet from one of the founders of the website you may have heard of, Orange Bloods, before, big website that has for a long time covered Texas recruiting. His name is Jeff Ketchum. He writes on X over the weekend, the Derek Cooper recruitment's a reminder that money in college football matters, and that's okay. It sometimes matters more than official visits, and that's okay. It sometimes matters more than any other factor, and that's okay. I think a lot of people, probably to a degree, believe what Ketchum is saying, but when they hear Steve Sarkisian clearly trying to pretend otherwise, an eyebrow is raised because of that. And once again, the question comes back of, well, if what the Texas recruiting reporter is saying, then why is Sarkisian trying to go so far out of his way to prove otherwise? And this is where, if you're a Georgia fan, I do think you take some comfort in this. If you've ever watched any movie ever, sports movie, something along those lines, the way that Texas goes about its business, that particular action behavior, Lamborghinis all over the place for official visits, things like that, guys who show up after not really developing much of a relationship with the coaches, that sort of behavior, that's never been the good guy in any movie you've ever seen. And what Kirby Smart describes, relationships over transaction, things like that, that feels a little bit more like the protagonist, doesn't it? And so that's perhaps why Steve Sarkisian goes so far out of his way to pretend that Texas isn't buying its players. We pretty clearly have a strong degree of evidence that they are. But here's the problem. We'll finish up. As I said to start the conversation, life isn't always like a movie. And sometimes the team that gets the most offseason hype because of the money that it's spending, a la Ohio State a year ago, they do go on to win the national championship, as much as maybe those of us who are Georgia fans don't want that to be true. And just because Georgia, in our mind, seems to be going about it the right way, and Texas, in our mind, seems to be going about it the wrong way, it doesn't mean that Texas still won't win. And it doesn't mean that Texas won't win the national championship. But perhaps Kirby Smart, who, in a question about the so-called secret sauce he has to beat the Longhorns, maybe the closely held belief that he referenced in that answer, maybe that's enough to power Georgia at least one more time. And maybe this November in Athens, these dogs, no matter how much money Texas spends, maybe they can beat the Longhorns once again. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We're glad to have you with us, I should say, no matter how you get to us, live on video, 10 a.m. across all platforms, radio noon, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Rev, podcast wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, everything else. We're just glad to have you as a part of the show today. It's fun to be back in our friendly confines of our studio after, for the most part, a full week away last week at SEC Media Days. We're glad to be back today. And so thankful to our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia who make it all possible. You know, when I talk about being in our studio and how comfortable that is, I'm reminded of you in your own home there too. There is nothing like the comfort of home. And of course, there are things you can do to make sure that comfort in your home is just as comfortable as it's supposed to be. And this time of year, one of the things you're perhaps thinking about is how hot it is outside, and that AC that's working probably overtime in your house right now, how that AC can kind of stay in the house where it's supposed to be. Because let's face it, if you've got inefficient, poorly fitted, just kind of old windows, well, a lot of that air conditioning that's kind of flowing through your house flows right on outside of your house, and you're essentially paying for AC that you're not using. Well, that's obviously a very bad financial decision. So how about making the decision right now to give your home what it deserves, the chance to upgrade the windows and then save yourself money on your energy bills as a kind of a part of doing that. That's what our friends at Pella Window and Door of Georgia are always about. They're Energy Star approved windows. That means you're going to have the chance at great savings on your electric bill or your AC, all the stuff that you're spending big bucks for. You're going to have a chance to get great savings on all of that. By the way, speaking of great savings, Pella also offering that to you at the moment here. How about 0% APR for 72 months? Of all the offers from Pella, this is one of the most popular throughout the years, and it's your chance to get some of that here right now. So I want you to check out PellaGA.com/DawgNation. That's the website. PellaGA.com/DawgNation. You can also give them a call, 678-638-1429. That's 678-638-1429. Reach out to them today. Have that initial consultation. Talk about the chance to upgrade those windows and really investigate the new technology they offer. You'll be really glad you did. And you'll find out why we've been saying it for a very long time, that Pella Window and Door of Georgia is going beyond. We love having Pella as a part of DawgNation Daily here today. We also love having you. We got Jon Stinchcomb here coming up in just a moment. But prior to that, let's get ready to go around the DawgHouse here today, poured by our friends at Dr. Pepper. Let's keep the conversation going about exactly what Georgia needs to do in order to kind of correct the record and beat Texas again and prove all of those who picked the Longhorns win the SEC. What can Georgia do to prove those folks wrong here once the actual games begin? Well, one of the things that we know is Kirby Smart also sort of made sure to reference that this year for the upcoming season, not by a wide margin, frankly, I didn't think this was an outlandish statistic necessarily, but Smart clearly made mention of this, that Georgia's got 54% of its roster for the upcoming season as first or second year players. That seems about normal to me. But nonetheless, Smart made a really big deal about that, just with COVID year guys being gone and things like that, that this is overall a less experienced roster than it's perhaps been in the past. And so Smart, in light of that, was asked the question of, okay, well then how do you develop new depth, knowing you've got young players who haven't played very much, knowing that rosters feel the strain of transfer portal and things like that more so than ever before? How do you, and I think the premise of the question was, how do you kind of rush those guys along and make sure you accelerate the process of getting them ready to go during the fall? Well, Kirby Smart said, hey, listen, you can't take shortcuts when it comes to stuff like that. This is also Kirby Smart from last week.
First of all, you don't speed up development. That's a misnomer. So if you want to speed up development, then you're probably looking for shortcuts that don't exist. You want to develop somebody, it takes time, it takes reps. We can't replicate reps faster. We can't speed up a guy's transition. The transition it takes to become a good football player is different for every kid. And I've been fortunate, for the last 19 years of college football to learn that and learn that it takes what it takes, and it takes time to grow those players. Now, I wish I could speed it up. I really wish I could speed it up this year, but there's no remedy or magic potion or we're going to go get this guy out of the portal or that guy out of the portal. It's all about continuity and what you do with each team. You're seeing that across college football where there's beginning to be a little more parity, I think, and it's probably going to continue to go that way. So who does the best with what they have, which is what I enjoy about the game.
So what Kirby Smart says there reminded me of a quote that I also saw this week from Texas A&M coach Mike Elko. And I'm not going to play the clip. I'm just going to simply read it to you. Pete Thamel from ESPN made reference to this, that Elko, and I think this is a pretty interesting level of insight coming from an SEC coach. He's speaking about his own team here, but I do think there's some relevance here as it relates to Georgia. Let me show you this on the screen. Thamel writing of Elko. He says an interesting nugget from Texas A&M's Mike Elko, who says winning the SEC typically means having around 13 NFL draft picks. The quote from Elko is this: we should get to double-digit NFL draft picks this year. That'll be the first time Texas A&M has done that in a very long time. So I think that's interesting insight from Elko, who says his own team is working towards kind of getting to that level. But we would certainly say for Georgia, hey, what is the special secret? How come Georgia won the SEC this past year? How come it's had the national championship success that it's had? Well, it's these like double-digit draft classes, dozen plus, 13, 14, 15, whatever it's been for Georgia these recent years. that's where that's been true. And what Elko is meaning there is not just future NFL draft picks on your roster. He means current guys on this team that'll be drafted the following April. And I think that's a really important distinction to draw here. For instance, as it relates to Georgia, there are guys on the Georgia roster for this season. Think about KJ Bolden, think about Nate Frazier, guys like that, maybe incoming freshmen. You might think about a Talon Taylor, a CJ Wiley, or whatever. There are guys on the Georgia roster that most of us would feel pretty comfortable saying that's a future NFL draft pick. But that's not what Elko's talking about. He says you better have around 13 or more current players who will be drafted this particular year, the following calendar year, in that particular April. And so if you want to talk about Georgia getting its depth to a championship level, that's sort of what I think we need to be looking at pretty closely. And I don't have time to do this today as much as I'd like to, but that's what we will do in the very near future. Hey, who are those draft eligible players? Players not in that sort of year one, year two that Smart says makes up 54% of the roster, but the other 46% of the roster. Some of these are very much known commodities. Dalen Everett's an example of that. Christian Miller is an example of that. There are others of these, though, that have maybe been waiting in the wings, and they've been biding their time. And now is their chance here in 2025 to show that they are also future draft picks, just like so many of their predecessors at Georgia have been. But that's probably really what it comes down to for Georgia to have the kind of success this season that we all wanted to have. Interesting words from Mike Elko pairing nicely with that clip from Kirby Smart. And that is also around the DawgHouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. Of course, Dr. Pepper, fun thing to enjoy here in the summer. The Dr. Pepper Blackberry, the Dr. Pepper Blackberry Zero Sugar. And as you're shopping at your local Kroger or wherever you're picking up your groceries here this time of year, of course, you look for those specially themed Dr. Pepper cans around the summer blockbuster movie Jurassic World Rebirth. A lot of folks are really enjoying that, and everybody's enjoying the delicious one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper. So have some fun this summer with these specially themed cans, and frankly, just make Dr. Pepper a part of everything you're doing here as you're enjoying your time with family and friends and everything else. I've been, boy, you better believe these hot days, I've been truly, enjoying my Dr. Pepper, especially as I'm sitting on the back porch or something like that. Always a fun thing. So make sure you enjoy some too, and keep in mind that when it comes to DawgNation Daily and Dr. Pepper, it's a Pepper thing. Glad to have them as a part of Around the DawgHouse here today. Okay, so before we're done on today's show, we will look more deeply at the predicted order of finish with the media last week at SEC Media Days and some of those all-SEC teams that perhaps do give us a little bit of a hint where those, if 13 is the magic number, where those 13 draft picks are coming for Georgia here this year. We'll get into all of that. But for now, so thrilled to have him back here on the show after a couple of weeks of not being able to speak to him live. Let's speak to Jon Stinchcomb today here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let me bring in Jon Stinchcomb. Glad to have him. John, hope you had a great vacation and am enjoying all of your sort of summer moments here as we start to inch closer to the college football season. Several topics I want to hit with you here today. Let me begin, though. I think Mike Elko gives you kind of an interesting number. He's obviously using Georgia as kind of a reference point here and teams sort of like Georgia. He says you better have about 13 draft picks if you want to win the SEC. That just sort of speaks to the overall talent level of the league. And I think the distinction there is important. This is not future draft picks. Georgia may have 50 or 60 of those, I guess, if you really start doing the math on that. But you better have, of the junior, senior ranks, guys who've been in your roster now going on 3 years or more, you better have at least 13 of those. And on paper, it's not obvious if Georgia has that number or who those will be, but the development of those, to use kind of an old-fashioned word, those upperclassmen-style players, that really determines your championship success. I think that Elko is kind of onto something when he references that there, John.
Yeah, I think history will show that he's right. You look at the teams that have been competitive in the SEC, the ones that have matriculated to the top for the championships, national championships specifically, they always have a loaded roster of players that are headed to the NFL. So when you're evaluating what it's going to take, I think Coach Elko is right on the money of saying it takes that level of player, that caliber of player to compete for championships in the SEC. That's where the level of play has reached and risen, and he's spot on. Look historically at Georgia, that when they've had their best teams, did they have the best players? Yeah, that's what it takes. So Georgia, Texas A&M, every other school across the SEC is looking at what they're going to play against, and that level is risen over the years, and it's going to take some great players. That's no mystery, and for him to actually put a number on it, I think it just highlights the fact that Georgia's been able to stay at that level for quite some time. And in this past week, the SEC all SEC rankings came out, and Georgia was pretty well represented. So when we did speak last, BA, we were talking about how they weren't recognized on the national scale, but or seen, but there's certainly been some recognition across the conference.
And probably if you want to get to that number, you probably still have to kind of cultivate some more of that. And that's what makes, I would say, the season fun. It's also what makes the process of kind of getting ready for that interesting, is that there's no shortage of potential. There's no shortage of, you and I could go back and forth. You name a name, I name a name. We could just do this over and over again. We'd have a very long list of guys that would sort of fit the either all SEC mold or the, potential, impressive NFL draft pick mold. Obviously, not all of those potential breakouts are going to kind of break in Georgia's direction. But the mystery here is watching of all of the potential, like who is the group that actually fully materializes. And that is, to Georgia's credit, one of the things it's done kind of well for a while is you start the season thinking, okay, well, this guy could be it, but he's an unproven commodity, at least thus far. And Kirby Smart, to his credit, the development game has been in such a way that they do sort of, more often than not, they seem to get more guys there than not before it's all said and done, right?
Yeah, and I think you start at the defensive box. I mean, you look at the number of guys that Georgia has put into the league just from the box, linebackers, defensive line, defensive ends. It's been an impressive haul. So that, I think, continue to be kind of that strong point for Georgia. I think the mystery is who else across that defensive front kind of comes to the forefront. Christian Miller is obviously a guy that everyone is expecting to play at that high level, but he's not alone. I mean, you look at Jonah Ajayi and Jordan Hall, those both two guys that came in as 5 stars that have been a part of the program for a while. And then Griffin is another 5-star that's, it's his first year, but for Georgia to play, as Kirby highlighted, and I think you made a good comment, 54% are first 2-year players, and that means about a little less than half, or right at it,
right,
are guys that have been a part of the program for a while. So I think that's kind of the metric that seems expected. So for any team that will have players that are going to the NFL early, you're going to have to replace them with younger talent. So guys that have either just now coming to campus or have only been on campus for a year, the expectation is that they're going to contribute. And this year is no different.
You mentioned the All-SEC team. I've noticed this. You may have seen this. And I really don't think I've ever seen this before. Maybe it's happened before. I just don't remember having seen it. That when you look at the first team All-SEC for specialists in that sort of special teams category, Brett Thorson, first-team punter, Peyton Woodring, both first-team place kicker and kickoff specialist. Bo Gardner's the first-team long snapper. Zachariah Branch is both the first-team, return specialist and, kind of the all-purpose type guy too. That Georgia clean swept its way through all of the first-team specialists. I don't know that I've ever seen that before. I do think that's a really valuable commodity to have for the upcoming season. Obviously, the worst moment of the Georgia season last year involved special teams, the kick return touchdown against Notre Dame. So pretty clearly there's more involved with special teams, more so than just the kickers and the snappers and the return men. But, certainly to think that Georgia's got that kind of representation among its kind of special teams role, that's a pretty interesting distinction to begin a season, is it not?
Yeah, I thought it was a neat little aspect of the All-SEC team being named. I know you mentioned the Notre Dame return. On the other side was Ohio State's whiff at the strike of midnight as the new year turned. So special teams are obviously huge in big games, and it's going to be important. But it seemed more, anecdotal than anything else. I think adding Branch is exciting. You saw what he was able to do at times at USC and what he could bring. I think Dorson coming back healthy would be a big factor, but yeah, I sure would like to see more of your meat and potatoes guys, especially on the offensive side of the ball, more represented. But I thought it was pretty cool to have at least an entire branch, whether it was an offense, defense, and now special teams that Georgia was able to own.
And no pun intended when it comes to Zachariah Branch, you made a reference to there too a moment ago. Like there is a chance, and listen, obviously everybody sort of had said the same thing about Zachariah. When you first saw him debut as a college player at the beginning of the 2023 season, this was one of the most exciting electric guys that you had a chance to tune in and watch. And early days at USC sort of showed it. Since then, it hasn't kind of always worked out for whatever reason. I'm not an expert on USC football, won't pretend to know. But, I mean, there is a real chance, certainly as a receiver and perhaps in a special teams way, as a kick returner in a way that we haven't seen at Georgia in a very long time. Like there's a chance, John, that Zachariah Branch is just one of Georgia's most important players. And for a team that needs to be a little bit more electric and probably a little bit more exciting, a little bit more just sort of explosiveness within the kind of, the offensive realm than existed a year ago. I mean, there's a chance that Zachariah Branch could be one of the main candidates to help provide that. I do think, if nothing else, to see him sort of prominently listed on this list the way that he is, I think that ought to get Georgia fans even more excited for his debut with UGA this fall.
Yeah, I think he's a guy that natural ability just jumps out at you when you watch him play. I think the biggest question has always been development, and you just heard a clip about Kirby saying you can't accelerate those things. And for a guy that has now been a part of college football for a couple of years, I think it'll be important for him to not only prove to himself and to the team that he's more than just naturally gifted, that he can offer more specifically on the offensive side of the ball. But just as part of his development, that he's progressing. And all these guys, everyone who comes to the University of Georgia, they come to play there with the anticipation and expectation that this will be a platform for them to play at the next level. And I doubt Zachariah Branch is any different. So I think he probably recognizes for him to earn those opportunities, it's going to take improvement. And it's not just relying on, God-given ability, because, you watch him with the ball in his hands and he's electric. He's a player that you're excited to see, and you want to find ways to get him the ball. We've had guys like that in the past. You look at Arian Smith with his just freakish speed. Georgia has tried to find ways to get the ball in his hands, and I think Branch is no different, where the more opportunities that you can get him the ball, great things can happen when you have freakish athletes that are just natural in their ability. And it's his job and the coaching staff's job to continue to develop him, so it's not just special teams, that he can be a contributor on the offensive side of the ball as well.
We talked about Georgia and Texas comparisons off the top of the show. Texas won another recruiting battle against Georgia on Sunday. This for a player that, if I've got my facts right, I believe that I do, only visited Texas just the one time, did not take an official visit there. And boy, that really seems like a real monetary-based recruitment to have that happen. We read a tweet from one of their recruiting reporters that said you shouldn't have to apologize for money being a major factor in all of this. And yet somehow Steve Sarkisian at SEC Media Days last week didn't seem to want to give full voice to the financial prowess that Texas has and the role that has played in their recent talent acquisition success. John, if NIL is legal and if some teams are just better at it than others, why don't they just be honest about it? And I do mean that question literally. Why don't the top NIL schools just admit the role that finances are playing in the success they've had acquiring players?
Yeah, I think as a head coach, you want to say that relationships is first and foremost, that yes, NIL, I think this is probably what the fan base of all teams they want to recognize is that NIL is a factor. Well, yeah, of course it is. But as a coach, what he is pushing and promoting is relationships. Every team does. Georgia does the same thing. And, we're kind of at that top tier. We have a great collective. We've managed our assets well. There's no denying the fact that we've been able to add players because of NIL opportunities. So I think just recognizing and being forthcoming with that is what fans are wanting. But from that head coach position, I think Coach Sark is saying, hey, it's not just. And I think if that's how you started these press conferences, it's not just NIL. That, yes, money is a factor, but so is relationships, so is opportunity, so is development of players, so is facilities, all the other aspects. I think what fans, when we get our feelings hurt, it's because we think it is just NIL. And his pushback is like, no, yes, that's a factor. Yes, money is a factor, and it's allowed in today's game. That is going to be a factor, but it's not just the dollar bills. That we've tried to develop a culture and a program that players want to be a part of. It's the same mantra that Georgia has had for years. Yes, we can get you those opportunities. Yes, we can try to promote your brand, but a couple of the foundational aspects of our program is relationships and development. And that's what the best programs do.
Yeah, I mean, to me, as someone who obviously wants Kirby Smart's sort of, I guess, agenda to kind of win here, because obviously I'm pro Georgia, but I'm also sort of pro college football as it's been, I do take some comfort in someone like Sarkisian, essentially last week saying some things that just sort of strain, I guess, believability. It just didn't seem all that believable what he says, like downplaying the role that finances have played in their success to the degree that he did. And the fact that Sark feels the need to give so much lip service to, hey, if you're just coming here because of money, you're probably not the right guy for us. I do think that reinforces, you know what, there may be something to what Kirby Smart has been saying. He's not just saying that as a way of sandbagging or, being against athletes getting compensation, things like that. Maybe this idea that you still going to be able to develop relationships, the fact that someone who's pretty clearly benefiting from some of the financial stuff on this, we just know Texas has a lot of money, no matter how much Sark tries to, downplay it. They have certainly leaned on that, pictures of Lamborghinis during, official visits, things like that. But the fact they can't just come out and say, yeah, we're Texas, come here if you want to have the most investment in you of any program. The fact they won't just come out and say that would lend me to believe there must be something to the way that Kirby Smart says that Georgia wants to go about its business, because nobody seems to want to be caught doing the opposite of what Kirby's describing.
Yeah, I think if we're just going to be candid, and that's what I think fans want more than anything, is just be upfront about it. Just say NIL is a factor. It is a factor. Miami recruiting, Texas A&M recruiting, Texas recruiting. One of the biggest factors that they can offer, one of the biggest carrots that they can dangle in front of one of these great recruits is we've got NIL money. We've got plenty of backers that can go and add individual deals outside of the collective, outside of the rev share, that can put more money in your pocket. And I think that's what fans are asking for, is just let's be real, that recognize the equation as you're presenting it to these players. And it's almost, I think fans are a little bit offended at times that, they don't get that level of candor. And maybe it's not owed to us, but when you say that it's less of a factor than it probably is, I think that comes across as offensive. And you know what? I don't think he really cares. I don't think that he cares that he's offending the fan base of rival schools when, he's promoting development and relationships, even though it's players that we know, especially some that have left our state, some that, live 5 miles down the road from me in Grayson, that, has been a part of the Georgia recruiting machine for the past 5 years. And you see, talent that's been coveted and wanted and cultivated, that continues to walk out. And, is money a factor? Yeah, it is. And for those that follow recruiting, it stings a little bit more. And you say, let's just recognize the fact that money is a major factor here. And I think maybe it would be more palatable. And I think other coaches are saying, I'm not real concerned about how palatable it is for the fans that it's bothering.
So we'll finish with this, kind of a different subject, and frankly, a much less pleasant subject than, whatever Georgia's going to do to win the SEC. So it's the time of year where, you just don't want any news. There is this sort of time, mid to late July between now and the start of the season, where you just don't want any news, because whatever news comes out now is almost never good. It may be something related to an injury, which you hope to avoid, or some sort of off-field type thing. Georgia, which has been kind of quiet on that front, did have a couple of those things kind of pop up. Seven Cloud, a longtime Georgia commit, top junior college, really probably the top junior college prospect in the country, defensive lineman. There are a couple of, I guess you'll say, domestic allegations against him right now, facing some charges for that. Jackson, offensive lineman, facing what could be a felony charge, or maybe it gets pled down, related to some marijuana stuff. I think we're still waiting on more details to come out, certainly on the Jackson situation. John, I don't really have much to offer by way of opinion on this, other than, boy, you just always sort of brace this time of year for the worst kind of news. And when you talk about, large number of, athletes on one roster, it seems like sometimes that's sort of hard to avoid. But kind of wrong kind of headline I hear for Seven Cloud, wrong kind of headline here for Jackson. And frankly, just I think still kind of hoping for more information on that and seeing how this justice process is going to play out, right?
Yeah, it's always unfortunate. I think you look at the other two legal issues that Georgia's had with Easley and Tuggle, and both those guys are no longer a part of the program. So I think its response is always a factor. How will Georgia deal with some of these issues, and recognizing we don't know all the details. We don't know the ins and outs of each one of these cases, but the hope is that it will be dealt with appropriately. And, whether it's Ja's marijuana citation that just popped up, or what seems to be more significant to me, the Seven Cloud domestic abuse deal.
Yeah, I would agree.
I mean, that's what we've seen in the past is that Georgia deals with each situation individually. And for some players, they were allowed to come back on the team or join the team and let the legal system run its course. And I'm sure there was penalties that were involved in that. And for others, they were no longer a part of the team following, the process that Georgia goes through. And there's always room and space for us to sit on the outsides and criticize and say that, well, if I were in that situation, I would. But we don't have all those details.
That's
and
right.
I think Georgia has done its best job to deal with each case individually. And they're not all on the same plane. You look at it and you go, domestic disturbance or domestic violence, there's no place for that. And I think Georgia in the past has taken a pretty hard line against some of those cases, and I think rightfully so. So
Yeah, I think
as this plays out, we'll just kind of have to monitor and see what the response is.
No, I think that you're bringing up a really good point. I think that Georgia has done a really good job of taking every situation. And listen, every football team is going to deal with that. It's been kind of a rough offseason in the SEC, as it relates to off-field infraction, things like that. But I think that Georgia's always done a really good job of handling all of these situations individually, letting, the player's situation kind of, get the proper judgment it deserves within the confines of just that player's actions. I think they've done a pretty good job as it relates to stuff like that. Unfortunately, they'll be asked to do that again here. And as new information about Ja or Seven Cloud comes out, we'll certainly provide that here on the program. John, very wise words from you. I certainly appreciate that. I'm glad to have you back on the show again. Trust that you had a wonderful vacation. And, of course, as we're speaking here, kind of getting to be the later part of July, only a couple of weeks away from fall camp starting, and then the season right there around the corner after that. Can't wait for that. And, of course, we'll look forward to our chance to talk to you about all of that in the days to come.
Yeah, I look forward to it, BA, because we're only a couple of weeks away from talking about the reports that are coming out of practice and real football and not what's happening off the field. So it's we're right there at the cusp.
No, I love it, John. Great stuff. We'll look forward to talking to you soon.
I appreciate it. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs indeed.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, so I don't have a ton more to offer on the Seven Cloud or Jaw Jackson situation. They're, by the way, unrelated to each other. They just happen to be kind of within the news at the same time. I'm guessing we'll hear more details with the Jackson thing coming out. And as John said, you know, the Seven Cloud thing to me seems to be at face value a little more troubling potentially, although once again, I won't pretend to be necessarily an expert on that, but I'm guessing certainly in the Jackson case, there'll be more news coming out because I don't even think we have a police report on that yet. But on both stories, there'll be more news that comes out, and we'll just sort of give it to you as it does come out here. More news on that yet to come. Now, let's talk about something happier. Let's get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and let's talk about all of the exciting things getting ready to go down with Royal Caribbean here right now, including in just a couple of weeks' time here, really just a few weeks away, the debut of Star of the Seas. Now, I had my chance to be on Star of the Seas. I had to postpone that for a little while because we got some big things coming up, including the start of the football season, and I didn't want to be away from you with all of that going on. But that means I'll just have to live vicariously through those who are on Star of the Seas, because it's going to be one of the most exciting debuts we've seen in the cruise industry in quite some time. Sailing out of Port Canaveral, and this is what's exciting for me is because if you live here in Georgia like I do, Port Canaveral is kind of the closest port to you. It's sort of our drivable port. It's really easy to get to. When I can drive, I like to. And to think that we've got an Icon class of ship in Port Canaveral now, really kind of continuing the legacy that Icon of the Seas started, going back, a couple of years ago, a year or so ago. To think we've got a ship like Star of the Seas coming to Port Canaveral, to me, that is just so incredibly exciting. And I can't wait for all of you to get your experience with that. So Jessica Slater is a wonderful travel advisor. She can tell you all about it. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com, and be a part of a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation on Star of the Seas or any of the other great Royal Caribbean cruise ships here coming up in 2025, heading towards 2026. All right, as we're cruising around the SEC here today, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, let's talk a little bit about some of the media picks going back to last week. So off the top of the show, made a big deal about Texas being ahead of Georgia when it comes to the predicted order of finish, getting twice the first place votes that Georgia did. Georgia, however, got significantly more first place votes than the third team on this list, which is Alabama. And as much as we'd love to sort of beat the drum for Georgia being undervalued, and maybe it'll turn out that they are, I also think there's a chance that Alabama is certainly undervalued right now compared to what the overall chatter is about it. For instance, think about this from a Georgia schedule standpoint. For all the attention that Texas is getting, do you really think that's a tougher game for Georgia than Alabama is? And I don't just mean because, Alabama has given Georgia fits and Georgia has given Texas fits, at least the two games last year. That's not necessarily what I mean. For those of you that try to kind of dive deep and look at the rosters and things like that, yes, the Alabama quarterback is an unknown, and I get that. But, boy, I see a lot of talent on Alabama, really both sides of the ball. Ryan Williams on offense, LT Overton on defense, really good offensive line, more proven offensive line right now than what Texas has, at least on paper. I don't like the idea of Alabama being undervalued because we obviously don't like the Crimson Tide, but I think it's probably the case for them. As we said before, I also think it's interesting, how much more love a team like LSU is getting. They got 20 votes to win the SEC. Compared to, teams like, say, Tennessee and Ole Miss, which only got one vote to win the SEC, but have the same overall win total. That, I think, puts a lot of pressure on Brian Kelly to say that even though from a projection standpoint, you're in a similar category of teams such as Tennessee, Ole Miss, you've got to sort of break through and have a much greater degree of success. I find that to be pretty wild. And by the way, speaking of all of that, a lot of what LSU is going to be kind of built on this year is the fact that it has the true veteran returning at quarterback, Garrett Nussmeier. I sort of thought from the media Nussmeier might have gotten tabbed as the preseason first team All-SEC quarterback. That actually went the way of Lenora Sellers. Now, I'm a big believer in Sellers. I like him a lot. He obviously was fantastic, certainly like November on last year as the Gamecocks kind of went on their little bit of a mini run there, kind of the final third of the season. But I was still a little bit surprised that Sellers got tabbed over Nussmeier for this first team All-SEC pick here. If Nussmeier's not a first team All-SEC level player, I don't know that we're talking about LSU as a true legitimate playoff team. And, if Sellers really is the best quarterback in the SEC, as this preseason projection suggests that he will be, then maybe the chance that it's the Gamecocks will actually break out and kind of take that next step, fringe playoff contender a year ago, actually becoming a playoff contender here this year. If Sellers is that good, well, I obviously think that suggests a lot of possibility for what the Gamecocks could be able to do. Let me give you a couple of thoughts on a couple of other positions here for a moment. When you look at the running back position, we heard Mike Elko earlier in the show saying, we're getting close to being the kind of team that can kind of produce double-digit draft picks. The preseason gambling projections certainly believe that's true. The A&M win total is like 8, in some cases 8.5, but you're going to probably see it 8 most places. That's one of the higher totals in the SEC right now. A lot of people like, the Aggies more than you perhaps realize. And, their running back, Le'Veon Moss, when he played a year ago, A&M offensively was actually pretty good. Kind of a tough-minded Mike Elko style team. Marcel Reed at quarterback is frankly not my cup of tea necessarily. Moss, though, is pretty good running back. If this guy kind of becomes the sort of household name at the running back position, then maybe A&M does exist with a chance to sort of surprise people. Their preseason projections, as I mentioned, probably higher than you realize. The other first-team All-SEC running back is Wisner, the guy from Texas that stepped in a year ago after Baxter got injured. We've kind of bashed, Texas a little bit, but, to be fair and balanced here for a moment, they were depleted with their running game last season because of injury before the season started. They actually navigated that pretty well. This year, I think they believe that running back and the running game overall can be a strength for them. And if that's the case, then obviously breaking in a brand new quarterback, it becomes much more dangerous facing Texas if they really do bring that level of success with the running game. A lot of people believe they can. No Georgia player made first team on offense. If you're interested in the defensive side, Christian Miller showed up as a first-team guy. C.J. Allen showed up as a first-team guy. Dalen Everett showed up as a first-team guy, as well as K.J. Bolden. So in total, 4 first-team All-SEC players for Georgia. And I would say that's very good news. In some of the preseason lists we've seen this offseason, Georgia hasn't quite gotten the love that maybe you'd kind of like for them to be. But obviously, when you look at the wisdom of crowds here, a lot of people voting on, these SEC lists, SEC credentials, about 1,000 folks for certainly several hundred folks for SEC media days. A lot of awareness for whoever it is. Allen is, Bolden is, Miller is, despite the fact that Miller and Bolden were not even at SEC media days. A lot of awareness of them. If Georgia, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, if they can produce 4 first-team All-SEC type players on defense, then this defense taking a step to be back to at least more towards what it was in those national championship years, that is certainly a strong possibility. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And as we wrap up today, we'll get ready to give you a golden shoe here. We can bring that music down just a little bit. We'll get ready to give you a golden shoe here. Our buddy Georgia on tap, a couple of nice entries from him. First of all, he shows off here. He and his dog watching the show from their home. You love to see the DawgNation Daily broadcast right up there on the big screen. Good shot there of his dog kind of looking in on that. That's fun to see. And he also shared this. The meme of the if you're not watching a video, what looks to be a Florida cooler with the Gator logo on the side of it. And Real Georgia Untapped shares this to the Gator hater extraordinaire. The meme text says, Costco's get what they're calling their camping toilets on sale now, which is very funny. Yeah, a lot of folks would certainly find some creative ways to use those very ugly-looking Florida coolers. We'll give Georgia on Tap a double golden shoe for all of that. That's fun to see. Also, lousy, stinking Gators. Speaking of them, having a long time since they've beaten Georgia, about 1,717 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That's our Gator hater updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews is when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs, showing up on time, doing the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust them on that. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to record a really fun interview today that's actually going to air on a future episode of DawgNation Daily. The reason why I tell you that is because I got to get ready for that. So I'm going to take kind of like a quick trip around the comment section, and then we'll come back and do more comments later on this week. But we've got to do a fun interview today that's going to kind of prevent us from being able to take as many comments as we'd like to. So let me do that now, and we'll get ready to enjoy more of that later on this week. All right, on Facebook here to start things today. Archie Hughes, by the way, looking forward to seeing Austin Simmons as the Ole Miss quarterback. He could be a very good one. He could be for sure. He was at Media Days last week. Let me see what else. Apparently there must be a Texas fan in the Facebook comment section because a lot of folks kind of referencing him here right now. Let me say hello to our YouTube people. Mike Bobo Stinks in the comment section. We just call him Stinks. Said the Texas folks are denying it's about money. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how hard they are working to make us not believe the evidence that's right in front of our face. I think that's true. Gary Roach checking in. Gary, glad to see you. Anonymous Handle says, which game is more important to you, Florida or Alabama? Well, my sort of cop-out answer on all of this has been, if we do believe that at least one loss is almost guaranteed, certainly likely, and even two losses might be probable, and I think it's fair to say with this Georgia schedule that might be the case, then success for Georgia is kind of determined by how long you can prolong that loss. So games in September, such as Tennessee and Alabama, they take on added significance because what you don't want to do is put yourself into the true must-win situation. Season's on the line. You got to win it to stay in it. You want that if that game comes, and for almost every team, eventually it probably will come. You don't want that game coming any sooner than it has to. So I think what you're asking is, as the ultimate Gator hater, do I say the Alabama game is more important than Florida? Rivalries aside, I would say that early season games for now are more important than late season games because you don't want to be in that situation where you're just sort of playing for your postseason life in the middle part of October. But if you're not careful, that's where you could be. Foster Moss on the subject of the loud music sometimes. Yeah, every now and then. Some of that music, unfortunately, is recorded a little bit loud, so every now and then it kind of pops in loud. Unfortunately, that is the case. Not Cody today, though. Cody's not here. Wyatt Fielden says, so close. Pads start popping in 2 weeks. Yeah, certainly looking forward to that. Jack Fullerton asked a question about Elo Mendoza. Let me see if I can find that. Jeremy Harbin checks in to say that Georgia's deeper and developed guys better than Texas, so not so concerned at all. Kirby gets the majority of guys he wants, and if they don't want to be Georgia, that's okay. We'll still be elite. So Jeremy's showing a lot of confidence here today, which I'm sure Georgia fans like to see. Let me try to say this again. Frederick Meredith says you're not there until you win a national championship, which Texas will do soon enough. but they're not there yet. You have to do it on the field like we did in our Raymond James Stadium in Indianapolis. Yeah. So Raymond James is that's Lucas Oil in Indianapolis. Raymond James is in Tampa. But I still get the point that you're making for sure. Let's get some DawgNation.com comments here today. Rambo says, do current roster players have multi-year contracts that require them to stay? To a certain extent, we don't fully know all of this, but we do have pretty strong reason to believe. I think the two most prominent rumors are that Damon Wilson's folks, really Missouri, upon securing Wilson off the Georgia roster, did have to pay a buyout clause back to Georgia for that. I think there's even more sort of substantial evidence that when Ole Miss brought in Walter Nolan, they had to pay Texas A&M for his services. There is at least some of this that goes on. Are those rare examples? Are those common examples? I don't know, and I can even verify that both those stories are true. But they're fairly prominent rumors around some of that kind of stuff. Not, I don't think reported on the record, but certainly openly speculated about. It's thought that that's true. So there is at least some degree that what's being signed now, market agreements, things like that, does bind both the player and the program. There is, it binds the program to paying the promised funds. It binds the player to, fulfill his end of the deal. And by the way, we obviously point out when a player tries to leave early and, the attempt by the program to kind of recoup that cost. But there are also examples, we've heard rumors about this of, prominent player goes to so-and-so school for a promised sum of money. And as it turns out, when you get there, the school then starts to hey, I'm sorry, we don't quite have the money we said we're going to be able to pay you. There was at least a period of time in the NIL era when that kind of thing was sometimes happening too. UJ Marine says the Seven Cloud news isn't news. The incident happened in April, but obviously, as you know, if it just now comes to light, then it's going to be news that we learned about it. So, that seems to be, a degree of nitpicking. Matt Rickervin on the subject of the SEC country Facebook. Yeah, I believe we've leased that. And by we, I mean, my corporate overlords. I believe we have leased that for someone else's usage. Let's see what else. Rambo says, at what point do you start seeing defections from your team when high school signees get more money than proven productive college players? That's a fair question, but we also have a lot of situations in the NFL where rookies make more than veterans anyway. In other words, to say, well, our veteran players, the guys who've been here more, are going to be the highest paid players in our team. That is, to a degree, sort of a noble mission. Seems like a nice way to go about your business. But as we talked about last week, that doesn't change the prerequisite that you've got to have elite talent at the most important positions. And if you're not willing to spend the most for them, then what's your plan for getting them? I mean, and I do think the importance of that question isn't going away anytime soon. That, hierarchies are just naturally forming in human life. I mean, there are just hierarchies of compensation and hierarchies of competence and hierarchies of all kinds of stuff. It is just a naturally occurring phenomenon in life amongst humanity. And so, getting used to so-and-so making more money than so-and-so else on a team, that's just going to be a thing that happens. And, I think that Georgia has been commendable in its efforts and attempt to sort of preserve locker room chemistry. And if you can do that forever, of course you would want to. But there is also within that a requirement that you've still got to have the elite talent that gives you a chance to be competitive, especially at the most important positions, a la defensive line, which we talked about last week. All right, final comments for today. As we said, we've got to bounce out of here because we've got some work we've got to do. Chef Jay Bowen says, what's next for Georgia at running back? I'm not quite so sure, to be honest with you. I'm not quite so sure. Obviously, Georgia did secure the commitment of Jay Lamar, but it also wanted Derek Cooper too. We'll maybe find out from Jeff Sintel. He is back from vacation, kind of what's next for Georgia at that running back spot now. MG in the YouTube comment section, not a believer in Arch Manning. We'll find out if that ends up being true. Anything else on Facebook? Joseph Kennedy predicts that Georgia will beat Texas in Athens. Boy, a lot of Georgia fans would love to see that. If you can do the trifecta in Austin, in Atlanta, in Athens, boy, that'd be pretty fun. That would be pretty fun. And look, I think, we will obviously have, Texas fans check in during the offseason. I do get that. I think that some Texas fans might find the attempt to interact with Georgia fans to be a little bit frustrating because, like the one thing that I don't think successful people by and large are interested in is somebody telling what they're going to do. Hey, man, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do whatever. And I think for a lot of Georgia fans who have, over the course of the last few years, had various fan bases pop in here to tell us what they were going to do, a lot of Georgia fans have just gotten jaded by that because so much of what we've been told was coming in the SEC has sort of never really arrived. For instance, let's just look at Georgia's hated rival here for a moment, Florida. For those of you who are kind of new to the SEC, new to Georgia, here's what you need to understand. That when Florida hired Jim McElwain as coach, a lot of Florida fans were showing up at all the stuff that he was going to do, and he's going to do this, and he's going to do that. And then McElwain gets fired, and then Dan Mullen gets hired. And then all of a sudden, these Florida fans are really in here saying, boy, he's going to do this, and he's going to do that, and he's going to take over, and Georgia's days are numbered. And then he gets fired. And all of a sudden, now it's Billy Napier and those same Florida fans that were talking about what McElwain was going to do and what Dan Mullen was going to do. And now they're just taking that same line of thought and they're transferring that. All of a sudden, now it's what Billy Napier is going to do. He's going to do this and he's going to do that. It just turns out not to be true. And so Georgia fans have heard it all in terms of what so-and-so SEC team is going to do. And so now we've got Texas fans in here saying, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And listen, I'm not a liar. Of course, your team has a very high talent level. Of course, there is a really good chance that y'all do it. I mean, as I said before, the most hyped team in the offseason the last 2 years has gone on to win the national championship. Ohio State last year, Michigan the year before that. Got a lot of offseason love, turned out to be true. The Texas thing may turn out to be true. But proclaiming it before you actually achieve it, that's not going to get you much with Georgia fans because a lot of these proclamations that Georgia has been told about have turned out to be false. And especially for an organization like Texas football that has a multi-decade track record of just being soft and just being all hat, no cattle, all sizzle, no steak. The idea that you would be the sort of overrated team that can't quite live up to expectations, that sort of feels real because for how many years in our lifetime that's been true. So just something to keep in mind with all that. DeMarco Thomas laughing at Cooper saying that Texas is RBU. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty funny. All right, we got to get ready to go for right now. I promise we'll do more comments tomorrow. But we're going to have to get ready to bounce here today. Anonymous Handle says Texas fans just need to be more grateful that they are now in the best conference for their ball club. And they need to be grateful for what a gift the SEC's given them as far as the schedule situation goes. Texas' success mostly has built on the back of kind of non-legacy SEC teams that, bumping into a true legacy SEC team like Georgia hasn't worked out quite so well. Now, the league has given you a big favor once again. Same easy SEC schedule. They have also given you a bye week before you play Georgia. So they've made it easy for you again one more time. your entrance into the SEC has certainly been sort of paved by rose petals here thus far. I agree with our commenter. You probably ought to be pretty grateful for that. Rambo on the subject of at DawgNation.com on the frustrations of trying to figure out how to manage the roster management from year to year. This is the one thing I think can be fixed. I don't think the NIL stuff related to compensation, I just don't know how much that's ever really going to be able to be fixed. I just think that as it comes to compensation, people are going to do what they're going to do, and the House settlement, we've always believed, is relatively powerless to stop that no matter how hard they tried. And the early days of that, they have been trying. We just don't think it's going to succeed. But I do think there's a chance that you could bring some of the roster stuff into balance a little bit. We think there are already some multi-year contracts taking place. We think there is some stability related to that. And for as crazy as some of the NIL stuff is, the transfer portal the last couple of years, if you haven't noticed, has not exactly been as crazy as maybe it once was, or as crazy as it has been predicted to be. So I do think if you want to be optimistic, there's room for that when it comes to roster stability related to the transfer portal. But when it comes to the sort of crazy compensation war and the race to see who can pay the most, it's going to take actual market forces bringing that to heel. For instance, it was only a couple of years ago that it wasn't Texas, but Texas A&M, who was being talked about as spending recklessly and buying whatever player they wanted. Well, when that didn't work, we haven't really heard from them again. So keep that in mind, that it's fun to be the big booster, big ego, stroking checks, buying players. When you feel like you're going to help your team win the national championship, there's a lot of sort of inflation to your ego that comes with that. But when the money you spend doesn't result in a championship, and for some of these programs, that's going to be what happens, all of a sudden now you just feel poor. And rich people don't like to feel poor. And spending money on something that proves not to be worth it is a good way for a rich person to feel poor. And that's how I think you get some sort of basic market economics sort of correcting some of what has sort of felt like a pretty crazy stretch of some of the NIL stuff, even in the aftermath of the House settlement. But we'll talk more about that in the future. For now, let's make that our R.S. Andrews cool down and remind you that you can find R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on that, including getting your AC tuned back up to factory fresh specs, plumbing emergencies, they'll take care of that for you. You can find them online, rsandrews.com. The RS, of course, stands for Rapid Service. Y'all have a great day. Back tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We might have a special announcement for you tomorrow. I'm hoping that we do. We'll see. But back tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Pella Window and Door of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.